and I will be talking to you today about visual literacy and graphic basics. This is something that I will start by introducing myself. So I'm Russian-born, Belgian citizen, educated in Spain and living in Dubai. I have been working with Asia as well since 2009. So really multicultural. I have my education both in business as well as in fine arts. So I got my MBA from Spain, from Yesa Business School. And last year I have completed my master's in fine arts from Academy of Art University in USA. I have a vast experience in sales and marketing, primarily in medical devices and PPE. And I have been an exhibited artist since 2015. So this is what makes me qualified to teach this class today. And I hope that you will enjoy it. Please ask your questions if you need to ask. And let's get started. So what is the agenda today? We will cover two major topics. When it comes to graphic literacy, those are very important. First one is composition. So composition is anything that has to do with the placement of different elements on the canvas or the paper or the screen, whatever you're dealing with, right? Now, color theory is the second part that we will cover. That has to deal with how do you use color effectively. So let's start with the composition first. Definition of composition by Henri Matisse is that composition is the art of arranging in a decorative manner the diverse elements at the painter's command to express his feelings. So basically composition, there are certain rules to it, but in the end, it depends on the objective. What do you want to express? So what are the elements of composition, right? So what makes the composition? First, line and shape. And that makes sense, right? So like you can see here on the screen, this is a composition, right? Texture. So differences in texture, they will make for a composition too. Anything that sticks out to the eye will make a composition. So like here, you can see on the example, it's very even. But if I were to put something with different texture, it would immediately pop to the eye. You would immediately see that. Then another aspect is value. So right now, for example, if you look at me, you will see that I'm on a white background. So I stand out against the white background. Why? Because I am darker than the white background, right? Then color. So color we will cover today in a lot of detail, but differently colored elements, you obviously have a distinction between them. So that, of course, will give also different visual impact. Form. So here I'm giving you an example you can see, right? So if you have a lot of round forms in your visual, and then suddenly there is one that is triangular, or it can be a square or anything different, again, that will attract attention. Finally, space. So space is a little bit tricky to understand. We are dealing primarily with 2D space. So we're dealing with the screen, like right now, or we're dealing with brochures or paper, or we're dealing with canvas, being an artist. In any case, what happens is that you have to create 3D dimension in a 2D space, which is a tricky task. And there are ways to do that. We will discuss some of them today, but this is quite important. So these are the elements at your command to manipulate and make your composition. Now, what are the basic rules of composition? So unity. What makes for a painting that is pleasing to look at? Something that is harmonious. So it has to be united by something. It has to make sense. And this is in terms of both the visual elements, but also the content. So for example, if you are painting elephants and suddenly in the middle of all elephants you have snow, that will be strange. And that is something that's not unity. So you have to be cohesive in terms of what you want to express and in terms of the visual elements. Secondly, balance. So balance, this is a different subject. So when we're talking about balance, let's imagine we have a brochure, a marketing brochure. And at the top, we have, let's say, the logo, we have the header, and then suddenly there is a lot of white space before the text. Is that balanced? No, because you will have a gap that will be in the wrong place and it will attract the wrong kind of attention. So that will be imbalanced. Or for instance, you have a painting and in the painting on one side, you have a lot of different elements and on the other side, nothing. So that's also unbalanced. So creating that balance, that everything is more or less balanced, that's important. Movement. So movement is probably one of the most important topics that we will cover today. So there are different ways of creating movement in a two-dimensional space. And that is especially important for designers and marketeers because this is what you want to create. You want to guide the flow of the eye according to what you have designed, so that the eye doesn't go everywhere, the person doesn't know where to look, but that they have a specific guidance as to how you want them to look at your space. One of the easy ways to demonstrate that would be to say, well, for instance, you have diagonal lines leading to something. So that something will automatically become focus point, and we will talk about what that is in a minute. But it also will guide the eye directly to that point. Now, another theme is rhythm. So rhythm is something where you create a lot of similar shapes or almost like a sequence. For example, fence. That would be an example of a visual element that creates rhythm, fence. These are the 4 elements we covered so far. There is more. So focus. Focus is another very important one. We said that movement is one, well, focus is another. Focus is probably the one concept that we need to learn today, is how to create the focus. The focal point, psychologically, for the eye, if it's correctly constructed, will always remain the same. So you will have an eye going directly to something on your space, be that painting, be that web design, be that the brochure. It will go to a certain space if you create it right. And there are many ways to do so. Then contrast. So contrast is also a tool at your disposal to work with. If you have an area of high contrast, normally it will attract a lot of attention to that area, especially if the rest is less contrasted. Pattern. So pattern is a tricky tool to use, but in many, especially ethnic cultures, it's used a lot. And this will be a repetition of different combination of lines, shapes, or colors to create a sequence. And finally, proportion. So proportion is about logical sizing of different elements according to each other. So for example, if you paint a painting and there is a person which is the same size as a mouse, then that will be out of proportion, unless this was your intention, right? But normally, person bigger than the mouse. Or if an element is very far from you, it becomes smaller to the eye. So if you create it bigger to the eye, that would be also out of proportion, right? So these are the principles that we covered. We said unity, so meaning everything is united and makes logical sense. Balance, meaning that all elements are relatively balanced to each other. Movement, meaning how do we lead the eye through the composition. Rhythm, meaning specific guidance to how to move the eye through the space. Focus, one of the important points, as I said, is where does the eye go first. Contrast, that helps you to create different elements, that's to guide the movement of the eye. Pattern, this is a repetition of the same kind of lines and shapes and colors. And proportion. Now, let's go into probably the most important rule to learn in composition. It's called the rule of thirds. So when you are constructing any composition, a lot of people tend to go and put the most important element in the middle. So for example, if you are painting a face, you put it in the middle. Actually, that's not the best placement. In art, what they teach you is that actually the most pleasing and interesting composition is the one that follows this rule of thirds. What is the rule of thirds? It means that the best placement for the focal point is somewhere either here, here, or here, depending on your intention. And also, it's kind of the same. If you turn it around, it will also be, you divide in threes, and then you see if this is where you want to put your focal point. And that is something that a lot of classical painters use. And here I put an example from Salvador Dali, who is my favorite painter. Now, this is something that is really important even in today's design. When you think about your space, you have to figure out what do you want to be the focus of that space, for example, on a marketing brochure, and make sure that the focal point, the most important point that you want to make, is positioned accordingly to this rule of thirds. Another important comment is the rule of odds. So when you have 2 objects or 4 objects, you can divide them evenly in your space. And that's not very good. In fact, again, it becomes boring and the person loses interest very quickly. So instead, better to put an even number of objects, and that would in fact attract better attention. Here I have put an example of photo with the jellyfish to illustrate the point. But as you can see, this is something that is psychologically more interesting for the viewer. Now, this one is a very interesting topic, is about positive and negative space. So we are used to think about our space as, what do I want to say, right? And especially in marketing, we think about the text, we think about the logo, we think about the photographs. All that is good and well, and this is called positive space. So positive space is basically the subject of your visual space. In a painting, that could be, for instance, let's imagine we're doing a portrait. So the face of the person in the portrait, that would be my positive space. What we do forget about all the time is the negative space. So the negative space means the space around. And when we think about it from the point of view of visual communication, it's actually equally important. So it's not enough to only think about this face in the portrait that you're painting, but also about the surrounding. How does that look? And here I'm giving you an example. So you see, we have 2 paintings, black and white, where you see different things. So if you look at the first one, you look at the black outline, you see 2 faces. Then if you look at another one, it looks like a vase. So actually, this is what happens to UI. One of the most common plays on negative and positive space is in fact yin yang, which is very, very common and very well known. So here you don't know what is the positive and what is the negative space. And actually for your eye mentally, this is always the case. So when you're thinking about your different elements and their placement, never forget about negative space. It's equally important as the positive space. Now, there are certain types of composition, certain examples of composition that are considered classical. Now, I will walk you through them. It doesn't mean that this is the only way to be, no. As long as you follow those simple rules we just discussed, that is fine. But the classical composition is pyramid, so anything triangular. And I will show you later some examples. Secondly, diagonal. A very clear example of that would be if you have seen ever paintings of alleys, tree alleys. Those are normally diagonal composition. So it's basically going across the screen leading the eye from one angle to another. Cross, of course, everybody knows what that composition looks like. It's very common. Another one is an L shape. So this is where you have a concentration of elements according to basically the rule of thirds that we have just covered. Actually, this is very aligned with the rule of thirds. Another common composition would be S shape. A very good example of that, again, everybody knows different paintings of roads somewhere in the countryside, right? So those roads, they normally go like that. And that's a classical example of S composition. Finally, circular composition. So circular composition is very used in actually Asian art. So mandala, for instance, that would be a very common example of circular composition when you have the elements accordingly located along the circle. Balanced scales. So this is the composition where you would have more weight on one side, a little bit less on another, positioned accordingly. Steelyard is the similar kind of composition. And finally, radiating lines. So radiating lines is also very much used. Radiating lines examples would be like very famous paintings, religious ones. They often follow the central point, and then there are radiating lines into the different directions. So these are the types of composition. I think from the point of view of marketing and business, probably you would use diagonal, you would use pyramid, and you would use L shape mostly, maybe cross. But the others are more artistic composition. However, it is still important to remember about this, because when we will be talking about color, I will highlight how you can actually make the eye go through the whole journey and from one element to another in a certain way. So, examples. So here, I would like to hear maybe from someone. What do you think are these examples? What type of composition is this? Do I have a volunteer? No, okay. So if we look at the first example, here you have a photograph. This photograph, we mentioned diagonal composition. This is a very classic example. And if you see, it also follows the rule of thirds, because the chair is positioned between different thirds, right? Now here, what is interesting, we discussed value. So if you see, the background is similar value, the foreground is a bit darker, but then the focal point becomes this bench, which is very dark, and that is standing out to the eye immediately. So that's an example of the focal point in the composition. Your eye straight goes to this bench standing on the diagonal lines. And we also discussed movement, right? So if you see these lines, they naturally lead your eye to the bench. So this is really a classical example of diagonal composition. Now, if you look at this wave here, it is also following a rule of thirds. And this one is more a triangular or Steelyard composition or L composition, because you see like the shape goes a little bit like L. Again, with the rule of thirds. So we can see that this is positioned again along with the line of thirds. What is interesting here is we are observing that the negative space around the wave is in fact similarly shaped to the wave itself, right? Now, the next one is Mona Lisa. So Mona Lisa is a classical example actually of triangular composition, because we have this a bit pyramidic shape in the middle of the composition, slightly off center. That is classic example. Now, here, I don't know if you can see it well, but we have a river running through a field, and that's a classical example of S composition. So that's a little bit on the composition, right? The idea is that you want to position your elements that it will be visually pleasing, that it makes sense, and that you have some interesting elements to guide the eye through the composition, okay? Now let's talk about my favorite subject, about color. So color is an especially important tool for those of us who are in the business field, because of course, composition you cannot play around as much as an artist would, but the colors you definitely can and you should. So let's start with the definitions. There are 3 words that are associated with color that we need to remember today. One, and probably most important one, is value. So what is value? It basically defines how dark or light the color is. And here I give you an example of red color, right? So for example, black and white is obvious, yeah? But red also can be different shades of red. So it can be different value of red. And you can see here on the example, going from light to dark value. And that is important because we will talk about how to use the value to create a certain type of look. So hue. Hue is basically our eye perceives what? The wavelengths of different light falling onto the surfaces. The white is basically when all the light is reflected off the surface. The black is when all the light is absorbed into the surface. Everything else is in between. And our eye can not perceive the whole range of the spectrum, but a lot. And this is called hue. The most important colors, there are 3 of them. Why? Because you cannot create other colors. You cannot create these colors from others. They are not mixable. They are also called prime colors. We will talk about that later, but those are yellow, red, and blue. Finally, saturation. So saturation means how vivid the color is. Again, here I'm giving you an example. You can see again color red with different saturation, from very bright to kind of pastel neutral color. And that's important. Actually, the saturation effect can be achieved with mixing 2 opposite colors. We will discuss that as well. So value, meaning how light or dark, hue, meaning what exactly is the color, and then saturation, how bright is that color, okay? So let's talk about prime colors and the color wheel. So in color theory, we know that there are 3 colors that cannot be mixed. These are yellow, red, and blue. These colors, they are called prime colors. Everything else is called secondary or tertiary. Secondary would be a color when you mix equally 2 primary colors. Example would be violet. So if you go and mix blue plus red, you will get violet. If you mix red and yellow, you will get orange. If you mix blue and yellow, you will get green. So this is the idea of secondary colors. Tertiary colors means that I'm mixing a prime color with another secondary color. Example would be here. So I'm mixing blue primary color with green secondary color, and I get blue-green. So that's a tertiary color. Most important is to remember really red, blue, and yellow. These are the colors that are not mixable. Now, a lot of the time we discuss about warm and cold colors. That is important element in the composition, by the way, because you can make a contrast between warm and cold colors and hence guide the eye through the composition. So warm colors normally are this spectrum, red, orange, and yellow. The rest, what is violet, blue, and green, is considered cold colors. However, this is a relative term. You can have, for instance, a warm green, or you can have a cold red. I'm giving you an example here. So again, it's relative color perception. So the normal color green is considered cold. However, if you go to orange green, this will be a warmer color compared to the original. If you, however, add blue or violet to it, it will give you even colder color. So it's a relative perception, right? But traditionally, red, orange, yellow is warm, green, blue, and violet is cold, okay? Now, let's talk more about value. So value is the first probably element that we learned as humans to experiment with. If you look at cave drawings, they only had value. They used charcoal and it was one color only. So they had to play with value. Now, as we said, value defines how dark or light the color is. Now, why that is important? Firstly, you can create a fully 3D realistic picture with only the shades of the same color. Example would be white and black photography. And this we all know, especially those of us that are a bit older, we remember that. Now, there is what is called high key color scheme and low key color scheme. They will have a different visual impact. So if we have light colors primarily, like in the example here was the flower, that is called high key color scheme. Normally these, they will create a feeling of freedom, air, lightness, cleanliness. This is normally how you would use that. Low key color scheme is dark colors. So here you have another example of the same flower, but in dark colors, right? So what this creates is more mystery and drama. And if you compare the two pictures, you will see that you have a different visual impact from both. Yeah, one seems light and airy, and the other one seems a bit more dramatic. So this is about value. For example, if you want to create focal point, and we said this was one of the most important things, if you have a dark background, you want to put light color on the focal point because that immediately will attract the eye. The opposite is true. So if you have a white background and you put something dark on it, the eye will automatically go to that. Now, there are several different color schemes that can be used. The very first one is monochromatic. What means monochromatic? Means shades of the same color. So it can be blue, like you see here on example. This is actually, I'm from Russia, so I have put an example of our traditional dish painting in blue. My mom loves that. Another example here. So this is the color yellow, and making it darker, it becomes brown, but it's color yellow, monochromatic color scheme. And then of course the classical black and white picture. So you can use the same color, different values of the same color, and get a visual impact. This is the easiest color scheme in a way, because you can be sure absolutely that the color harmony will be there because you're using the same color. So nothing will be wrong with the color palette. However, it's also limited, of course. It gives you chances to play with value, but it does not allow you more than that. It's enough for a good composition. Black and white photography existed for years. We know that. Some of the traditional arts as well use that, and very effectively. But here we go to analogous color scheme. So analogous color scheme means what? We have seen the color wheel, right? We said there are primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, and everything in between. Now, analogous color scheme means that I take a color, let's say yellow, and I make a color palette of my visual adjacent to the yellow. So it can be, for instance, orange, yellow, orange, and orange, red. Or I can go the other way. I can say yellow, yellow, green, and green. Those are valid analogous color schemes. They will give you color harmony. Why? Because you have yellow in all of these colors. So if you go green, it means there is blue and yellow. If you go yellow-green, obviously there is yellow. If you go yellow-orange, obviously there is yellow. So these are related colors. So they will create color harmony, okay? Now, the most dramatic and impactful color schemes are called complementary color schemes. So how does this work? This is the opposite idea. You can take several colors that are adjacent and one which is the opposite of the main color. Here I'm giving you an example of red and green, which are opposite colors on the color wheel. And I'm saying, well, I will create my painting with red-orange, red-violet, and I will use green to counterbalance and create, for instance, focal point. So in this instance, what I would do, for example, I would paint my painting or web design, for example, in colors red, yellow, orange, and red-violet, but then I would make green elements to make them stand out against the others. And I can mix the two. It will give me a neutral color. This I would use for more background elements, for example, right? So this is the color schemes that I used, and I'm giving you here examples. So I will start with my favorites. This is Van Gogh, Sunflowers, one of my favorite paintings. Here what you see is an adjacent analogous color scheme based on yellow. You can see there is green-blue, and a little bit of orange. So all these, they are close on the color wheel. And this is what the artist is using in this instance. Next to it, you can see there is a painting with orange, red elements. Again, this is analogous color scheme. Very close, in fact, elements. There is a little bit of yellow there, but they are quite close together. Now, on this painting with the piers, what you can see is exactly what I was talking about in terms of opposite colors. So you have violet against yellow. If we go back, right? Violet against yellow here. You have blue against orange. So blue against orange. And you have red against green, which is what I was just talking about, right? Then we have here a violet-blue diagonal composition, by the way. You see how an alley of trees goes far by diagonal. And then it's highlighted also with the rhythm of repeated street lamps, yeah? So we talked about the rhythm. This is an example of that. It goes further and further into distance, guiding the eye. And we have yellow and orangey color scheme on the other side. These are complementary color schemes. So these are complementary colors. Finally, here you have this blue-green background with bright orange flowers. Again, this is an example of complementary color scheme. So basically what we learned today, we learned about the composition. What is important in composition? Probably the most important thing to remember is the rule of thirds. So do not try to center your composition. Don't try to put your most important element in the center. Try to do it off center, to the side of 1/3 or the other, and place it according to this rule of thirds. Also, what we learned important is rather use uneven number of objects versus even number of objects. And yes, there are different types of composition, and they have to be balanced and make sense. And you can create with the composition the movement of the eye through the total space that you have. That is especially important for marketeers because then you can have a flow. For instance, if you have a web page, what you want is that you want to make sure that your eye goes in a certain way. That can be done with value. The value is how dark or light the color is. That can be done with different colors, contrasting colors. We have discussed what would be contrasting colors. And it can be done basically through placing different elements according to your composition. Now, we also talked about color wheel. We said that there are 3 prime colors. yellow, red, and blue. All the other colors are derivative from those and can be mixed. Then we talked about monochromatic color scheme, which is color scheme based on the same color and different shades of it, yeah, different values of it. Then we talked about analogous color scheme. So we said that we can take on the color wheel adjacent colors, and that would make for a harmonious color scheme because the main color will repeat itself. And then we spoke about complementary color schemes. So this is when we take some colors from one side of the wheel and one which is opposite to it to create a contrast of color. So that's a little bit topic today. I hope you enjoyed the session. Do we have any questions? I take that as a no. Well, thank you everybody for attending the session. And it was my pleasure to see you. Have a great day. Thank you very much.